They saw the silver in her hair and called it decay. They saw the lines on her hands and called them frail. But they never saw the storm gathering behind her eyes, waiting to be unleashed. The wind at Scorpion Rock had teeth. It bit at any exposed skin, carrying the fine, abrasive dust of the high desert. It was here, in this crucible of elite military ambition, that Project Chimera stripped men down to their breaking points. When Helen Vance, at 60 years of age, stepped off the transport shuttle, she looked less like a candidate and more like a ghost who'd taken a wrong turn. The whispers started instantly, a venomous hiss carried on that same biting wind. They saw the intricate map of lines around her eyes and diagnosed it as fatigue. They noted the silver hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun and deemed it a sign of weakness. Her duffel bag was slung over a shoulder that seemed too narrow, her posture perfectly straight but without the rigid tension of the younger, muscle-bound men who eyed her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She ignored them all, her gaze fixed on the sterile, imposing facade of the administrative building. The jeers were just background noise, the sideways glances just shimmering heat off the asphalt. They simply didn't register. Her file, which lay on Director Croft's desk, was an even bigger anomaly. It was a single, heavily redacted sheet. No commendations, no recent operational history, nothing beyond a basic training certificate dated nearly 3 decades prior. To the ambitious, hardened staff of Project Chimera, she was a clerical error, a political statement, or worse, a liability. A body sent here to fail. Director Croft, a man who worshipped the documented lineage of a warrior's career, held the paper as if it were contaminated. A soldier without a past was a soldier without a foundation. He looked up as she entered his office, standing at a perfect parade rest. Her expression was a placid lake, betraying nothing. Vance, Croft's voice was low, clipped. He prided himself on efficiency. Your file is redacted. He let the word hang in the air, a demand for explanation. Helen's eyes, the color of a winter sky, met his without a flicker. It is what it is, Director. Her voice was calm, a low alto that held no hint of apology or defense. Croft leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. He saw the weathered skin of her hands, the almost imperceptible stiffness in her gait as she'd crossed the room. This isn't a refresher course, specialist. This is an evaluation pipeline for Tier 1 consideration. The physical and psychological attrition rate for candidates in their absolute prime exceeds 80%. He was giving her an out, a chance to walk away with her dignity intact. I understand, Director, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm here to meet the standard. A quiet sigh escaped Croft's lips, a puff of pure exasperation. He stamped her file with a heavy, final thud. Report to Gunnery Sergeant Morrison at the CQC facility. He's your lead instructor. He fixed her with a hard stare. Do not become a problem for him, Vance. And do not become a problem for me. Gunnery Sergeant Rex Morrison was a monument carved from granite and institutional fury. His neck was as thick as a power pole, and his voice was a constant, gravelly roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the training grounds. He believed pain was the most effective teacher and humiliation the purest motivator. When Helen reported to him, he gave her a slow, contemptuous appraisal, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, look what we have here, he boomed, ensuring the entire platoon of candidates could hear. Did the local history museum have a sale on artifacts? A few of the younger men snickered. Helen's face remained a mask of placid neutrality. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply waited, her stillness a profound counterpoint to his bluster. Her silence unnerved him more than any retort could have. You got something to say, specialist, he goaded. No, Gunnery Sergeant, she said. Morrison's eyes narrowed. He hated that quiet confidence, he saw it as arrogance. Good. We'll see how quiet you are when you're coughing up your lungs on the endurance course. He turned his back on her, a gesture of complete dismissal. All right, you maggots. Listen up. That dismissal became a daily ritual. On the rifle range, Morrison would stand behind her, a nagging presence. Control your breathing, Vance. You're wheezing like you're on your last legs. Yet, her shot groupings were impossibly tight, 5 rounds clustered so close together they looked like a single ragged hole punched in the target center. She never gloated. She simply cleaned her rifle with a focused, reverent patience, her hands moving with an ingrained familiarity that was almost unnerving. A young tech specialist, Eva Rostova, watched her. Rostova saw the world in patterns and data, and Helen Vance was a fascinating, anomalous data point. She saw how the younger, stronger men would sprint through the first 2 miles of the 10-mile run, jostling for position. Helen maintained a steady, almost metronomic pace. By mile 6, the sprinters were heaving. By mile 8, she was passing them, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. Rostova noted it wasn't about speed, it was about flawless energy management. It was a perfect algorithm of endurance. The lead antagonist among the candidates was Lieutenant Jake "Razor" Dalton, an officer with a chiseled jaw and an ego to match. He made it his personal mission to break her. "Hey, Vance," he'd call out in the mess hall. "Need me to cut up your food for you? Maybe get you something soft?" His friends would erupt in a chorus of condescending laughter. Helen would just continue eating, her movements deliberate, her silence a fortress they could not breach. They mistook her discipline for weakness, her silence for fear. They were boys playing with matches, trying to get a reaction from a hearth that had long ago grown accustomed to the flame. The pressure began to mount as the close-quarters combat module began. This was Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's kingdom. The air in the sprawling gymnasium was thick with the smell of sweat, rubber mats, and raw machismo. Morrison taught a system he called the Hammer Protocol. It was about aggressive, overwhelming force, breaking an opponent's will with shock and awe. "There is no defense," he would roar, slamming a fist like a sledgehammer into a heavy bag. "There is only attack and a more vicious counterattack." He demonstrated techniques with a brutal flourish, throwing younger soldiers around the mats like rag dolls. His eyes would often flick to Helen. Her form was different. When they practiced joint locks and throws, her movements were smaller, more precise. She used leverage, not muscle. Where Morrison would use a powerful shoulder throw to slam an opponent down, Helen would execute a subtle hip throw, using the other person's own momentum. She achieved the same result, a subdued opponent on the mat, but with what looked like half the effort and none of the spectacle. Morrison saw this efficiency as a perversion of his doctrine. It was not his way. "Vance. What is that?" he barked during one session, after she'd effortlessly put a man twice her size on his back. "You're supposed to drive through him, not dance with him. This isn't a yoga retreat. Put your back into it." Helen would simply reset and help her partner up. "Understood, Gunnery Sergeant," she would say, her voice betraying no emotion. Then, she would perform the technique again, her way. She wasn't being defiant. She was simply incapable of moving incorrectly, of wasting energy. Her body had been programmed by a different, more lethal software, one that prioritized economy of motion above all else. The chasm between what Morrison preached and what Helen practiced grew wider with every session. He saw her minimalism as hesitation, her precision as weakness. He couldn't comprehend that her method wasn't about avoiding a fight, but about ending it with the least possible exposure to risk. His philosophy was a roaring bonfire, hers was a focused laser. He began pairing her with the most aggressive, undisciplined brawlers in the platoon, hoping to see her overwhelmed by pure, chaotic force. But the results were always the same. A charging opponent would find himself suddenly off balance, his own momentum used against him. A powerful punch would meet empty air as she moved just enough to evade it, her hand already finding a pressure point or a vulnerable joint. She never hurt them, not really. She simply deactivated them. And each time, her placid expression and quiet efficiency chipped away at Morrison's authority, infuriating him more than any open challenge ever could. The culmination of the CQC module was the Reaper drill. A single soldier was placed in the center of the mat to face multiple, simultaneous opponents. It was a brutal test of endurance, spatial awareness, and raw will, designed to simulate the overwhelming chaos of close-quarters combat. It was designed to break people. Morrison gathered the candidates in a semicircle, his eyes gleaming with theatrical cruelty. This was his theater. In a real fight, you don't get to pick your odds, he bellowed, pacing before them. The enemy doesn't line up and wait his turn. Today, we separate the assets from the liabilities. His gaze settled on Helen, and a cruel smile touched his lips. We're going to run a special scenario today. A real-world test. 5-on-1. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The standard drill was 3-on-1, and that was considered a near-impossible task. 5-on-1 wasn't a test. It was a public execution. Specialist Rostova felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She looked at Helen, who stood perfectly still, her face as serene as ever. Dalton. Cole. Bennett. Davis. Chun. Morrison barked. The 5 officers he named stepped forward. Dalton, the ringleader, cracked his knuckles, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. They were the biggest, fastest, and most aggressive candidates in the program. They moved toward the center of the mat, circling the empty space where their victim would soon stand. This was the moment they had been waiting for, their chance to finally shatter her infuriating calm. Vance. Morrison roared. On the mat. Helen walked forward. The gym fell silent. Even the background hum of ventilation fans seemed to die away. Every eye was on her as she stepped onto the mat, her bare feet making no sound. She wore standard PT gear, a plain gray t-shirt and black shorts. As she moved, her watch strap shifted, revealing a small, faded tattoo on the inside of her left forearm. It was a whisper of ink, a stylized shape of a snake eating its own tail, an Ouroboros. From the observation deck above, Director Croft watched, his arms crossed, his face a grim mask of skepticism. He had come to witness the inevitable end of the Vance experiment, to see her fold and finally justify his assessment of her flimsy file. He was here to see a liability confirmed. The 5 officers circled her like hyenas. Dalton gave a mock bow. "Don't worry, ma'am," he sneered. "We'll make this quick. Wouldn't want you to break a hip." Helen didn't answer. She simply sank into a low, balanced stance, her hands held loosely at her sides. She wasn't coiled like a spring. She was settled like a mountain. She was waiting. Morrison blew the whistle, the sound shrill and violent in the silence. Dalton charged first, leading with his shoulder, a bull rush designed to slam her to the ground through sheer, overwhelming force. It was the move Morrison had taught them, a pure expression of the hammer protocol. But Helen wasn't there. At the last possible nanosecond, she pivoted on the ball of her right foot. It wasn't a retreat, it was a redirection. Her body moved no more than 6 inches to the side. As Dalton's momentum carried him hurtling past, she extended her right hand. It wasn't a block, it was a guide. Her stiffened fingers jabbed precisely into the brachial plexus nerve cluster below his collarbone. Simultaneously, her left foot tapped the back of his knee. His body, suddenly deprived of its signals and its balance, folded like a cheap suit. He crashed to the mat in a heap, the wind knocked out of him, a look of pure, bewildered shock on his face. The entire sequence took less than a second. It was so fluid, so economical, that many in the room weren't sure what they had just seen. The other 4 saw it. Cole and Bennett exchanged a look of disbelief before their training kicked in. They attacked together from the front and back, a pincer movement designed to overwhelm. Cole lunged for her head while Bennett came in low, aiming for her legs. Helen moved. She dropped her center of gravity, ducking under Cole's wild swing. As she did, she grabbed the wrist of his extended arm with both hands. She didn't try to stop his momentum, she accelerated it. Spinning with his movement, she pulled him off balance and used his entire body as a shield against his own partner. Bennett, coming in low, crashed headlong into Cole's legs. The two men went down in a tangled, clumsy mess of limbs. Before they could even process their mistake, Helen's foot stomped down hard on the side of Cole's ankle joint. Not with enough force to break it, but enough to send a blinding jolt of pain through it, incapacitating him. She stepped back, her balance perfect, her hands once again loose at her sides. 2 more down. The fight was less than 5 seconds old. The gym was now utterly silent. The snickers had died. The air was thick with a new, dawning horror. This was not a struggling old woman. This was a force of nature. Davis and Chun, the last two, hesitated. Their cockiness had evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal fear. They had been trained to fight soldiers, not ghosts. They looked at each other, a silent, desperate agreement passing between them. They would be more careful. They advanced slowly, cautiously, their hands up, circling her. They were trying to find an angle, an opening. They found nothing. Helen stood in the center of their circle, a point of absolute stillness in their storm of indecision. She was giving them time to think, and she knew that was the worst thing for them. Their training was about reaction, not thought. Thought bred hesitation. Hesitation bred defeat. Davis finally broke. He feinted high with his left hand and shot in for a low takedown, a classic wrestling move. Helen's response was a brutal piece of physics. As he came in, she dropped her right elbow, a short, sharp, downward strike onto the vagus nerve on the side of his neck. It wasn't a knockout blow. It was a shutdown command. His entire nervous system flared and then went dim. His muscles went slack, and he slumped to the mat, unconscious before he hit the floor. Now only Chun was left. He was pale, his eyes wide. He stood frozen, looking at his 4 fallen comrades littered across the mat. He looked at Helen, who hadn't even broken a sweat. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Her winter sky eyes were fixed on him, not with malice, but with a profound and unnerving patience. It was the look of a predator that knows the hunt is already over. Chun took an involuntary step back, then another. He held up his hands, palms open, in a universal gesture of surrender. He wanted no part of this. He was a soldier, not a sacrifice. Helen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance. She had not come here to hurt them. She had come here to meet the standard. The standard had been met. From the observation deck, Director Croft stared, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. He had seen bar fights and battlefield brawls, controlled sparring and bloody chaos. He had never seen this. This wasn't fighting. This was a form of art, a lethal geometry of motion that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. His eyes were drawn again to her wrist, to the faded Ouroboros. And then, a memory buried deep in the classified recesses of his mind clicked into place. A story he'd heard a decade ago from a grizzled CIA station chief in a dusty, forgotten corner of the world. A story about a phantom unit, a Tier 1 team so secret their very existence was denied by governments. They were sent to places that didn't exist on any map to solve problems that couldn't be acknowledged. They called them Unit Nyx, after the primordial goddess of night. And the best of them, the leader, the one they called the Ghost of the Ghosts, had a call sign. Cronus, Croft breathed, the name a prayer and a curse on his lips. Time itself. He was not looking at Specialist Vance, the 60-year-old rookie. He was looking at a living legend. On the floor below, Sergeant Morrison's face was ashen. The swagger, the arrogance, the roaring confidence, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, gaping incomprehension. He had spent weeks trying to correct her form. He had tried to teach a great white shark how to swim. A sound broke the spell. It was a single, slow clap. Specialist Rostova was on her feet, her hands coming together, her face alight with pure, unadulterated reverence. Another soldier joined in, then another. The applause rolled through the gymnasium, hesitant at first, then growing into a thunderous ovation. It was a sound of apology, of respect, of awe. The lieutenants who had mocked her, the soldiers who had dismissed her, were all on their feet, their faces a mixture of shame and wonder. Helen didn't smile. She simply gave a single, small nod to the gymnasium at large. A gesture of closure. She walked off the mat, past the stunned Sergeant Morrison. She picked up her small towel and her water bottle and walked toward the exit. Croft hurried down the stairs, his mind reeling. He intercepted her just as she was about to push through the heavy steel doors. "Vance," he began, his voice rough. He stopped. What could he say? "I'm sorry. I underestimated you." The words felt hollow, pathetic. "Your file," he finally managed, the words inadequate. "It doesn't do you justice." Helen looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't triumph. It was a deep, ancient weariness. "It's just a file, Director," she said softly. "It did its job. It was the most effective camouflage I ever had." She gave him a slight nod and pushed open the doors, walking out into the searing desert sun, leaving the noise and the revelation behind her. The doors swung shut. Sergeant Morrison walked slowly to the center of the mat, his entire belief system shattered. He looked at the young faces around him, their expressions of awe slowly hardening into a new, profound form of respect. They had all come here to be forged into weapons. They had just met the hand that had built the forge. True strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet wisdom that's been there all along. What do you think? Is experience the ultimate weapon? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please comment with respect for everyone's perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.